They called it progress. He called it betrayal. When genetically modified mosquitoes, engineered in pristine European labs, were quietly unleashed into the skies of Burkina Faso, the world applauded. But President Ibrahim Traoré did something else. He ordered them destroyed. Every vial, every permit, every whisper of foreign science masked as salvation. Why? Because on African soil, the word experiment does not sound like innovation. It echoes with memory. Traoré's decision sent shockwaves through the billion-dollar world of biotech philanthropy, funded by names like Gates and Open Philanthropy, backed by Imperial College London. It was not merely a rejection of mosquitoes. It was a rebellion against the logic that Africa must always be the test site, never the patent holder. Stay with us. This is not a rumor. This is a reckoning. Subscribe and witness what happens when Africa says no. What if the real epidemic is not malaria, but foreign ownership over African futures? On the 11th of August, 2025, a presidential directive from Ouagadougou reverberated far beyond the Sahel. President Ibrahim Traoré ordered the immediate suspension and dismantling of the Target Malaria Project, a multi-million-dollar initiative designed to combat malaria using genetically modified GMO mosquitoes. His instructions were clear. All lab samples must be destroyed, all field tests halted, and every permit revoked. To many outside observers, the decision seemed abrupt, even radical. After all, Target Malaria was one of the most heavily funded health experiments in Africa, backed up by over 170 million US dollars, with approximately 155 million funneled in from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and an additional 17 million from Open Philanthropy. The project had been promoted as a game-changer in public health. Its promise? A genetic sleight of hand to eradicate malaria-carrying mosquitoes. But Traoré saw something else entirely. These mosquitoes were not just insects. They were messengers, engineered in sleek European laboratories and deployed over African villages like digital code dropped from the sky. And their DNA had been rewritten not in Bobo Dioulasso or Accra, but in Imperial College London, a prestigious institution that held the patents, the know-how, and the power. Here lies the first fracture. Though the project operated on African soil, the core science, the intellectual property, and the authority resided in Western capitals. Africa was tasked with rearing, monitoring, and releasing the mosquitoes, but not with defining the rules. This was not partnership. It was protocol under foreign command. In theory, the science made sense. The modified mosquitoes, specifically male Anopheles gambiae, were engineered to pass on a gene that causes most offspring to be male. Since only female mosquitoes bite and transmit malaria, this would gradually suppress mosquito populations, and hence malaria transmission. But in Africa, history cannot be surgically removed from the present. When people in Burkina Faso heard genetically modified, they did not think of innovation. They thought of Bt cotton, once hailed as a revolution in agriculture, introduced under the guidance of Monsanto and, once again, the Gates Foundation. Within a few years, yields plummeted, pests adapted, and international buyers began rejecting Burkina Faso's cotton, citing inferior quality. The crop, once the pride of the nation, collapsed. By 2016, the government formally abandoned GMO cotton, citing both economic loss and reputational damage. Cotton had carried 60% of Burkina Faso's export revenue. Its demise left farmers devastated, indebted, and wary of foreign promises. And now a new promise hovered overhead, this time with wings. But what triggered Traoré's drastic move? Just days before the presidential order, a new batch of genetically modified male-biased mosquitoes was quietly released into the skies. The public was told it was only a pilot, not a gene drive. Scientists claimed it was safe. But within a week, the tone shifted. Years of permits were rescinded, decades of investment undone. Was there a breach? A hidden consequence? A warning missed? Traoré has yet to reveal the full rationale. But the symbolism is unmistakable. He chose rupture over compliance. A rupture not just with the project, but with the pattern of Africa as testing ground and the West as beneficiary. In a single command, he disrupted the narrative of benevolence and exposed a deeper question. Can sovereignty survive when science is outsourced? This is not a war on science. It is a war on science without consent, on projects approved by ethics boards but questioned by villages, on futures redesigned without the right to refuse. And as the high-security labs in Burkina Faso went silent and the villagers watched the trucks leave, one truth settled across the red soil. This was more than the death of a project. It was the birth of a resistance. But something must have gone terribly wrong. What was it that made a sovereign nation revoke the future overnight? The moment President Traoré's decree was announced, the streets didn't erupt in confusion. They sighed in recognition. It was not the first time foreign projects arrived in Africa wearing the white coat of progress, only to leave behind scars. Within hours, African networks lit up with commentary. Activist coalitions, scientists, farmers, and village elders didn't hesitate to speak. We knew this would come, some said. We warned them. From the dusty courtyards of Kudogu to academic halls in Accra, voices aligned in a rare unison. Copagen, the West African Network for Biosafety, issued a statement that reverberated across the region. We will not be your guinea pigs. That phrase, raw, uncompromising, summarized the deep current of mistrust. Not mistrust of science, but of the intentions behind its delivery. The emotional crescendo reached a higher pitch when parallels were drawn with the past. BT cotton was no longer just an agricultural failure, it became a cautionary parable. Back in the early 2000s, Burkina Faso embraced genetically modified cotton with the encouragement of agribusiness giants like Monsanto, alongside funding from global donors. Promises abounded: higher yields, resistance to pests, and economic empowerment. Reality was crueler. Within a few seasons, farmers reported that the quality of their cotton fiber had deteriorated significantly. Bollworms, the very pest BT cotton was designed to resist, returned stronger, meaner. The high costs of patented seeds and compulsory chemicals sent farmers into crippling cycles of debt. By 2016, the Burkina Faso government officially abandoned GMO cotton, citing economic losses and international rejection of their exports. The once proud cotton sector, accounting for 60% of national export earnings, was now a textbook example of technological dependency gone awry. Those who lived through that collapse were watching the skies again, this time not for rain, but for mosquitoes with modified bloodlines. It wasn't just a policy reversal. It was a collective act of memory. Mothers recalled cotton money that once paid for school uniforms. Farmers remembered buying seed year after year, never owning it. Elders spoke of traditional varieties that vanished once corporate hybrids took root. And now, the same logic was returning, but this time cloaked in the language of medicine. They say it's about malaria, said a community leader in Wahiguya, but we see the same fingerprints. Foreign labs, foreign patents, foreign goals. The anger wasn't aimed at fighting disease. It was aimed at being told how to fight it without choosing the weapons. Meanwhile, media outlets danced cautiously. International coverage painted the story as a controversial decision that might delay malaria progress. But within Africa, independent channels hailed it as a rare act of defiance. And it wasn't just Burkina Faso watching. Across Mali, Ghana, Nigeria, and Uganda, similar experiments were planned or underway. Traoré's decision lit a match. Finally, said one Ghanaian commentator, someone has stood up. Beyond health and agriculture, the moment transformed Traoré into a symbolic figure, a president not afraid to press stop when the world demands speed. He was no longer just a head of state. He was a guardian of consent. Social media threads filled with calls for inquiry. Who approved the mosquito releases? Were villagers properly informed? What mechanisms exist to reverse an irreversible gene release? And with each question, a louder echo answered, this is not about mosquitoes. This is about power. Because somewhere between a cottonseed and a modified mosquito lies a bigger truth. Africa is tired of being the proving ground. The continent remembers every crop failure, every sterilization rumor, every headline that never made it to the West. And it remembers silence, the silence of global institutions, when millions in losses were incurred, when cotton collapsed, when biodiversity vanished, and now as GMO mosquitoes take to the skies. The rage wasn't isolated, it was generational. One comment on a Pan-African blog read, they test our soil, they test our seeds, now they test our air. What's next? Our children? It wasn't hyperbole. It was grief turned into vigilance. If cotton fell, could our skies be next? Could our bloodlines be the new battleground? In the weeks following Traoré's decree, Burkina Faso entered a new kind of silence. One not born of submission, but of recalibration. Laboratories shuttered. Trucks of equipment vanished under military escort. Contracts, some stretching back over a decade, were abruptly annulled. But the silence didn't last. Soon, debates erupted across media, universities, and markets. What had we gained? What had we risked? And what now must be rebuilt? The immediate consequences were bureaucratic. The government, now under scrutiny for previously approving the project, initiated internal reviews of its biosafety agencies, ethics boards, and public health partnerships. Civil servants who had greenlit Target Malaria faced investigation, not for corruption, but for negligence of national interest. But deeper tremors rippled through the country's social and political terrain. Many citizens began to ask uncomfortable questions. How did a foreign-funded experiment become so deeply embedded in our national health infrastructure without clear public consensus? And the implications went beyond mosquitoes. Economists warned that the collapse of a flagship biotech partnership could discourage future investment. But others countered, investment at what cost? The haunting memory of Burkina Faso's cotton collapse returned, not as history, but as parallel. When BT cotton was introduced with the same global enthusiasm, local farmers were promised resilience and prosperity. Instead, they got dependency. Smallholders had to purchase new seeds each season, bound by legal patents. GMO seeds were up to 5 times more expensive than traditional varieties. Many could no longer save or exchange seed, the oldest ritual of African agriculture, now criminalized by contract. Now, experts saw a similar pattern. A country asked to provide the land, the labor, the risk, but not the royalties nor the control. This realization triggered a national awakening. Radio hosts, town hall meetings, and teachers in rural classrooms began to ask, if we don't own the science that alters our ecosystems, do we own our future? Environmentalists pointed out that Burkina Faso's already vulnerable biodiversity had been further endangered. Studies in South Africa had shown that GMO maize had displaced indigenous seed varieties, seeds that had evolved over centuries to suit local soils and climates. Once lost, these varieties were near impossible to recover. The same trajectory was now visible in Burkina Faso, a slow erasure of local systems, knowledge, and independence, disguised as modernization. But perhaps the most troubling impact was psychological. Many farmers felt powerless. They had been trained to mistrust their own methods and defer to experts from abroad. For years, agricultural development had been framed as something Africans received, not authored. This dependency wasn't just about tools or seeds. It was about imagination. And so, Traoré's act, regardless of its economic cost, was understood by many as a symbolic reclamation. A journalist from Bobo Dioulasso wrote, when the president said stop, he wasn't just stopping mosquitoes. He was restarting our belief that we could choose our own path. For some, this moment marked the reemergence of a long-suppressed narrative, that Africa's development must not be scripted from Geneva or London, but from Zinder and Ouagadougou. This is anti-colonial Africa, not with banners or bayonets, but with sovereignty over genes, seeds, and skies. Of course, not everyone agreed. Critics warned that rejecting such projects might isolate Burkina Faso from international research funding, especially in public health. But supporters responded bluntly, if the price of aid is our autonomy, then we must pay in full for our freedom. This tension now lives at the heart of the country's political discourse. How does one balance collaboration with caution, innovation with ownership? Traoré has not offered an easy answer, but his decision has raised the stakes of every future partnership. As one university professor put it, from now on, no project lands here without a question. Who truly benefits? If Africa can no longer plant without permission, release mosquitoes without ownership, or feed itself without debt, how sovereign are we? As news of Traoré's directive spread beyond Burkina Faso's borders, international reactions arrived slowly, then carefully. There were no outright condemnations from Western governments, no urgent statements from global health bodies. Instead, the response from donor institutions, including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Open Philanthropy, was conspicuously muted. Privately, stakeholders were said to be disappointed, but publicly they kept their distance. Why the silence? Because what happened in Burkina Faso wasn't just a program being shut down. It was a precedent being set, a precedent that might embolden other African nations to question and possibly cancel foreign-backed experiments that operate under the banner of global good. Inside the walls of Imperial College London, where the mosquito genes were first manipulated, scientists expressed concern over the setback. Years of work, funding, and research potentially erased by a single political decision. But to many African observers, this imbalance was the point. As one Kenyan commentator wrote, if the knowledge, the patents, the power, and the institutions are all foreign, then why are the risks always ours? That question rippled across regional organizations. The African Union, ECOWAS, and NEPAD's Biosciences Office had all, at different times, voiced optimism about biotechnology's potential. But now, none of them offered clear support or critique. Instead, the burden of defense or resistance fell entirely on Burkina Faso's shoulders. And so, a deeper conversation began, one that had been simmering in African policy circles for years. What does it mean to pursue science without sovereignty? In this moment, African sovereignty was no longer a theoretical principle debated in Addis Ababa. It became a living question on the streets of Ouagadougou. When foreign donors provide the funding, international labs engineer the organisms, and Western institutions hold the patents, then where's the African stake? The case of target malaria forced a confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Most biosafety laws in Africa were written with heavy foreign influence. Many regulatory agencies remain under-resourced and deferential to donor partners. And public participation is often symbolic, not substantial. Thus, Traoré's act did not merely cancel a project, it exposed a system. A Nigerian health economist summarized it bluntly. We don't just need African science. We need African control over African science. This moment now sits in the diplomatic air like static electricity, charged, waiting. If other African nations begin to follow Burkina Faso's lead, the balance of power in international research will have to adjust. Because if the science is real and the risks are real, then consent must also be real. And ownership cannot be optional. What happens when a continent no longer owns its own biology? What now? What comes after the shut gates, the dismantled labs, the silenced centrifuges? Burkina Faso stands at a precipice, not of regression, but of choice. With target malaria dismantled, the road ahead forks into three possible futures. The first is self-reliance, a future where African nations invest in their own biotechnology, not to reject science, but to author it. Traoré's stand could inspire a generation of African geneticists, agronomists, and public health experts to build labs, draft policies, and write patents on African terms. Imagine a Pan-African research consortium, not dependent, but interdependent. Not reactive, but proactive. The second road is isolation. Global donors may view Burkina Faso's defiance as hostility. Funding may shrink. Offers of collaboration may disappear. But perhaps that is the cost of principle. Perhaps saying no must come with consequences. And perhaps in that cost there is clarity. The third and most delicate path is one of redefinition. A renegotiation of how partnerships are formed. Not in smoke-filled Geneva boardrooms, but at the grassroots level, where villagers, farmers, and local scientists co-design the interventions meant to affect their lives. This would require patience, transparency, and humility from all sides. But the greatest opportunity is not technical, it is symbolic. President Traoré did not merely cancel an experiment, he shattered a ritual, the quiet acceptance of foreign direction. His decision has transformed Burkina Faso into a test case of another kind, not for mosquito suppression, but for sovereign self-determination. And that transformation is not limited to borders. Already, voices in Uganda, Nigeria, and Ghana are calling for similar reviews of GMO programs. A South African newspaper recently ran the headline, "If Burkina Faso can reclaim its skies, why can't we?" The question is not rhetorical, it is generational. Because science will continue, so will philanthropy, so will disease. But what may never be the same again is the assumption that Africa will comply quietly. As one Burkinabe poet wrote the day after the announcement, he did not just kill mosquitoes, he lit a match. That match now burns across conversations, borders, and hearts. Will others dare to follow before the next insect carries not disease but destiny? This was never just about mosquitoes. It was about the right to say no to experiments we did not design, to promises we did not trust, to futures we did not choose. In ordering the destruction of target malaria, Ibrahim Traoré did not destroy science. He demanded that science respect borders, not just physical, but moral, cultural, and historical. Because Africa remembers. It remembers cotton fields turned graveyards, seed banks emptied by foreign patents, biodiversity traded for dependency. It remembers bodies tested, consent assumed, and dignity overwritten. And now in this memory, it reclaims a voice long suppressed. Anti-colonial Africa is no longer just a political stance. It is a scientific one. It is environmental. It is genetic. It is generational. When we speak of sovereignty today, we do not speak only of borders and ballots. We speak of ecosystems, of ancestral seed lines, of the right to refuse a future wrapped in foreign ribbon. African sovereignty means being the author of our own questions, not just the respondent to someone else's experiments. Yes, malaria still kills. Yes, innovation is needed. But innovation cannot come at the cost of identity. It cannot arrive with assumptions and leave with consequences. As Burkina Faso draws a line in the red soil, the world must decide, will it punish that defiance? Or will it finally listen? And as for the rest of Africa, the question is more urgent than ever. If one landlocked nation, battered by coups and debt, can stand up for its skies, what stops the rest from standing up for their seeds, their food, their bodies, their future? Because the battle for African dignity will not be televised in laboratories or negotiated in summits. It will happen where it always has, in the soil, under the sun, and in the soul. Anti-Colonial Africa has spoken, and it will not speak softly again. Do you believe African science must be African-owned? Or will the continent remain the world's testing ground? Share your voice below. If this resonated, don't just scroll, stand. Subscribe, comment, and share this story. Sovereignty begins with awareness.